I guess one of the questions that and this is for all three of you too, and I'm just going to hang out by Chris for just a moment here. Hi. I mean, it's really interesting that you're all talking about very different aspects, especially around history, historiography, how history is documented. Like thinking about, and of course I'm thinking too about how so much of a graphic design, the writings and things like they're much of what we write is right now not so very well documented, not very well connected back into an academic apparatus. So I guess my first question for you would be, what do you think about the academic document and like what that is? What's the authenticity of that? What is the authority of that? And also, what are we going to do in the moment where now we are at this moment where it's going to be contact the owner for this document for access? Like, how do we deal with the fact that so much of what we have written and said and recorded is now locked up in various clouds with different permissions? Like, how do you think about that authentication in a digital setting? And then I'll join.
That is that directly for me, that question?
Well, you just started. But
oh, yeah. I mean, like my relationship to academic scholarship is, I think as like a trespasser, because I was basically, that's okay. Like I was trained as a graphic designer and studied at, a glorified trade school with like a kind of thin humanities curriculum. And I think like my personal encounter with the sort of realm of like academic scholarship was through the work that I was doing. I was designing stuff for people who were writing interesting things. And so I was reading the stuff that I was designing. And then I went to, and then I said, that's when I sort of started to realize this sort of like alienation from the labor of designing, and decided to go to grad school, and there kind of fell deeper into this so-called world of ideas. And then so I went to grad school in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And there's a completely sort of different attitude around like writing and design there than there is here. Like the design academies there don't have like full-time tenure track positions for the most part. There's a like academic scholarship in these sort of traditional scholarly forms. It's not really a thing in the design schools. So there's a lot of like, for lack of a better term right now, like amateur scholarship happening there, right? Undisciplined scholarship or reflection, critical reflection. So that's sort of my background, and now I'm here. I had to come back. I'm from Canada originally, so I went back to Canada, started working at a branding studio, and started teaching on the side because I wanted to sort of like get back that thing that I felt like I had in the Netherlands, which was a kind of milieu of people who were thinking critically and sort of trying to cultivate a kind of intellectual community around our work. To sort of like enable a kind of critical reflection. So I got back into teaching, and then I got this teaching job at SUNY. I started teaching at SUNY Buffalo, which is an R1 institution, which is like a research institution that puts some emphasis on teaching on research rather than teaching. And there, I felt out of place because, again, I don't have this traditional training in academic scholarship. I asked, I was on the tenure track there. I asked a fellow faculty member, like, how do I score points in this tenure process? And someone told me, you're a graphic designer, you need to work for prestigious clients. I said, what's a prestigious client? They said Nike, Apple, Facebook. And I was like, I don't do that work, I'm screwed. So I started to sort of like realize that there's this kind of misunderstanding of design within the academy, which again makes me feel like a trespasser. And I often feel like I'm disguising something, or like I'm performing kind of through citation, through publication. There's like sort of double-edged sword for me. There's a kind of performativity to what I do. I think that tries to helps me try to like evade suspicion from where I'm at. So I don't know if I kind of wandered a little bit, but did I answer your question?
I think so. And Okay. Yeah, just looking back through so going back to the document too, and this is a little bit more towards Dakota here, is one of the things that struck me in reading your essay was like just really thinking through how the Bauhaus had documented itself so well, and that those documents were then, transmitted so well. I think about when I was in architecture school, they used to talk about how Corbusier saved every single receipt, every laundry receipt that he ever had. And that was one of the reasons why like we knew those stories as well as we did. So like, what do you think about I guess like what are you thinking about how that educational enterprise has managed, and I think Black Mountain, I don't know if it was in your essay, but somebody else was saying similar things about Black Mountain. How do you think that the way that we document and store our ideas about pedagogy now, or in the recent past, like how do you think that has influenced how we see these institutions in relationship to our own?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this is like a kind of a huge liability in design studies, is that so much of the history is written by the participants. That might be interesting in some cases, but I think particularly in the case of the sort of the kind of Cold War mythology of the Bauhaus, that this is my friend, wants my attention. This is really as I talk about geopolitics, it makes it very serious. The kind of Cold War mythology that's built up around the Bauhaus in the U.S. That is a very, very conscious. There are things, as I said at the end, that are very consciously suppressed or emphasized in that story. For me, like one of my and I have a PhD, but I didn't study with anyone who knew anything about design, and most of my theoretical inspirations also like came from elsewhere. So I think for me, one of my biggest influences is Adrian Forty's book from the 80s, Objects of Desire. And there's a very brief last chapter of that where he talks about this problem of sort of, the archive and the primary and secondary sources are all kind of mixed up because we mostly get designers' own interpretations of their own actions. And I think particularly in the United States, there just isn't a developed enough discipline of design history that has an identity separate from really, the kind of professional training, to Chris's point, that is most of what the institutions we work for does. So, I think it's great that there are so many documents, but I find even just in putting together design history lectures that it's really difficult to like nail down the dates for things. I mean, it's like the sort of the citational practices and the kinds of documentation are actually quite spotty. Even though we have images of everything, we don't really know that much about who was involved in putting them together when they happened even.
Great, and okay, now we have our names sorted out. All right, so and also following from that, I also think it's really interesting, Audrey, that you bring up a tycho. Like that's like a very familiar format for all of us, or not all of us obviously, but from anybody who went to Yale in that particular period is very familiar with those formats. And I'm really interested. It comes up from time to time. As we, again, like the way that we share things now with students is we have this whole flurry of PDFs and things, and the kind of staying power of those documents for ourselves, as we bring them home, as we keep, because there's the time of the document when you're supposed to be reading it or the history, and then there's the time after. How do you, I guess, where is my question here? But the staying power, the persistence of that particular bibliography then and now, like, do you have any thoughts about that, about how we can have whether they're personal bibliographies or they're shared bibliographies, how do they persist without a tycho, without a printed block to tell us what it is that we're supposed to be reading or that we read?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's certainly one that I am immersed in right now as I prepare for my winter classes. And I have all of these texts that I want students to access, and I do want them to. I'm teaching them how to do creative inquiry, and this is a new, relatively new course for me. So I want them to bring their own text into the pedagogy, right? And so I've started listing, I want to have like a hyperlinked document, right? That would link out to the many different PDFs that I have that I've just collected over the years, and give them access to it. But at some point, is that too overwhelming for them? How do you make your way through the enormous amounts of text that are out there? How does it become meaningful, and how do you make selections, right? So that is something I am certainly grappling with. And also getting them to go out to the library, right? So I do field trips with students where we walk across the street to our library, which is amazing here at the University of Michigan. And they learn how to do just a standard research of text, right? But there's so many bibliographies out there. And I know that I've been influenced in my career by the one that I think the AIGA developed with Meredith Davis and Andrew Blauvelt and Catherine McCoy, I think, and maybe even Lorraine, but I'm not really sure of all that participated, but they started bibliographies. And I think that certainly helps to have the professional organization collecting these bibliographies as well. But we do need to organize that canon, right? I feel that my presentation was a direct response to Dakota's question. Are we even getting the canon right, right? How do we get this right and I guess reorganize it, update it, and make it consistent across all of the different classes out there in graphic design? I think that's something that the that the AIGA and other professional associations can help with in terms of compiling this canon. Let's really see what it is and what it looks like and have it take form, right? And bring many of those texts from the periphery into the main area. That makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead and.
Yeah. Oh, this is going to echo.
Oh, you're going to have to turn. Yeah, just come over here.
Okay. Sorry. I wanted to sort of like speak to the canon a bit more and throw out maybe like a provocation around this sort of like efforts around inclusion in the canon. And I'll preface it by saying, like, I think these are totally valid and legitimate and laudable and required, right, to kind of like broaden the inclusion of the canon. But I think also we have to look at like what we even, and maybe this is Dakota's point too, like what we even mean by the canon, or like who is this sort of like, standards body, for lack of a better term, that determines what exceeds the canon and what doesn't. Because I think there are risks. I think there are traps potentially that we have to like be conscious of as we diversify and broaden the inclusion of the canon. For example, I have students in my studio classes that are now like the way that, sorry, let me rewind one step. Like I think of the way that graphic design history is used in curriculum often is as a kind of a resource for styles. This may be a bit cynical, but I certainly approached it that way, and I think a lot of my students approach it that way. So what I'm starting to see now in my studio classes is, like, just to be terse and brief about it, a lot of cultural appropriation, a lot of Orientalism, the studios are not that equipped to contend with or address this. As much as I want to, it's just like there's just not enough time. and not enough of a kind of framework for having that kind of discussion in the studios. The other thing is like to take the example of I think I mentioned this in my talk, the Asian precedent of the movable typography and printing press. I think it's laudable to recognize the precedents of movable typography in Asia, but valorizing precedents, I think, affirms a kind of like techno-progressive narration at the risk of forgetting that like the European printing press wrought hell upon the earth, right? It wasn't the Bible that was the consequential sort of artifact of Gutenberg. It was, again, the papal indulgence, which enables the sort of conceptualization of the stock certificate. The stock certificate gives birth to the stock market, the multinational corporation, the joint stock company. This capacity to print certificates and distribute them across a kind of national territory, a public, in order to distribute the risk of these colonial ventures. It made it easier for colonial ventures to amass large amounts of capital because of the printing press.
Just to respond to that, I think that both capitalism and the papal decrees and the Reformation would have used any tool it would have found. It just happened to find the printing press, like as its tool. But I do want to bring it also back to this question of great. Now I just lost my train of thought.
Could I just jump in while you are thinking? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
I think one of the ways that I've been trying to think about this problem that Chris raises is like I think some of the expectation of our students and even a lot of faculty about a design history course is that it's basically an art appreciation course, that every slide you're putting up is something that you're sort of venerating and that people should develop a taste for, and something that's like implicitly good. And I think that there's a lot of room in design history to do what I'm trying to do, what I think a lot of us are trying to do, which is like a critical social history that uses design to tell a certain kind of story. I think the question is like whether there is room in the curriculum to make that what a design history course is. Because if you get away from the idea that you're showing people the greatest things that have ever been made, then I think you kind of get around that problem of that Chris is raising. And I think another sort of, I haven't figured out how to do this, but I've just sort of figured out how to maybe name it, is that maybe there's a difference between being more inclusive, bringing more stuff in, and actually teaching the exclusions, teaching how things came to be excluded. Were they completely ignored or were they appropriated? I think that, I worry a little bit, I think like Chris, that, trying to fix the problem, trying to sort of patch up Philip Meggs, for example, might actually present design history as a much more integrated, happy, collaborative thing than it actually was. I mean, the institutions that we teach in are actually the product of a certain kind of canon.
It's articulated quite well with Martha Scotford actually brings this up about like digging up women in the history in a way that mischaracterizes what their roles were, so that you think that they were seen as equal participants when they were not. So there's that danger. But the thing that I trailed off from was, both of you have asked, or everybody has asked, like, are we getting the canon right? Like, I really appreciate the rereading too of the Bauhaus, of this other history, in the light of recent events, especially, in the light of like what we're going through right now. I think is super important, in part because, you might, I dare you, but like you might get a student to be able to cough up the name of like Walter Gropius, maybe. But the thing is, the ability to contextualize that in an actual like geopolitical time and explain what was happening, why it was happening, beyond just like, oh, he must be great. I think that capacity also is increased, as somebody develops like over time, like as a practitioner or as an educator, as a student. But I think we we don't really take into account how little the contextualization is there for even the European history itself, and it worries me a lot.
I can add something about the Bauhaus piece and Gropius. Having worked in Buffalo, people are very proud of this. Rainer Banham sort of tells the story about how Gropius visited Buffalo and saw the concrete grain silos and was inspired, and that inspired him develop the sort of principles of like modernist form, industrial form, the kind of like utilitarian American industrial form was the sort of inspiration. And
this is Corbusier in North Africa as well.
yeah, and so if you, it's like if you can say that, give that context, then you could start to talk about the way that like, or this, and this is narration, right? And I think this is the problem of history. It's not inclusion, but it's narration. Like then you can start to tell a story about how this kind of formal tendency starts to see it's sort of like the programs that it enacts as like containers for commodities, right? So like grain silos become housing units, become factories. To maybe to Dakota's point, that there's a kind of like the form is agnostic, but the kind of political context is actually its content, right? So again, it's like you can sort of like, we can be like American grain silos in Buffalo, New York, beautiful industrial, but like what is the story that it's trying to tell? That's a contestable thing.
And so I want to switch just a little bit as maybe one final theme to talk about in this discussion before we break for lunch. I'm really excited that everyone here is still standing over here. Audrey, you had talked about autoethnography, and I think this is going to come up again in the afternoon session. So I wanted to maybe try to unspool a little bit, like, you know, you're talking about it as a 1970s method, but then you're encountering it. Can you tell us, like, you know, when do you encounter it? Is it a historical method? Is it to me, it feels more like a pedagogical method as much as a historical method. There's a lot of teaching through autoethnography that comes up through K through 12, for example, in the present. You know, can you maybe tell us, like, you've found it to be a useful tool for yourself, but is it something that we should be doing in our classrooms now? And if so, how? Like, what are the pluses and minuses? Like, just
I think another really interesting question about autoethnography. It's something that I encountered in my theoretical research as a method for theoretical research. But it, you know, when I moved here to the University of Michigan, I just had this desire to move towards more autoethnographic research methodologies. I'm not sure I'm there now. So I see it more as a qualitative approach to theoretical research. I am using it in my classes, right? I'm using it in my creative inquiry course so that students, you know, can start imagining, students can take ownership of this path they're going to take through art and design in their curriculum here at the University of Michigan, and even start to speculate about what their professional career might look like. I want them to feel as if they have agency. They're not coming to me to sort of tell them what to do and how to do it, and even to look at what has already been done and imitate it, right? But to really create their own story as they move forward in this discipline and in their professional careers, and as they move forward as scholars, to bring their cultural perspective to what it is that they're learning in the class, and how they wish to branch out, you know, and apply what they've learned in society. So that is what I think that autoethnography has a very important power. I'm teaching freshman students as well, who are at the very beginning of their scholarly careers. And I want them to start having an understanding of how they have importance in design. There's a huge history out there, long history that may or may not be inclusive, but their experiences now matter. Their cultural background matters. And through this methodology, that is how that they begin to form their professional identity. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
I mean, I think so. I guess my question would be, and again, like, it's used in creative writing, it's used in a lot of different places too. start to
Mhm.
become engaged in the topic altogether. I mean, one of the things that we do in our classrooms is just model a kind of engagement with the field, for example. Where it starts to, and again, this will come up again as we go into the second session, I'm sure, is like some students are resistant to ethnography, for example. So what do you do in those situations where a student is for example not wanting to tell their story, or like not wanting to become part of the story that they're reading for themselves?
I don't know that I've encountered that with art students. I think that art and design students are very much focused on themselves, right? But it is the problem I encounter is that they do not want to engage with others and with the external world and with communities. And so it's through autoethnography that I ask them to sort of shape their thoughts about themselves within the context of, a public, right? Sometimes my autoethnography is about how would you want to change the world if you knew you could not fail? What would you do? What would you create? What would you want to, who would you want to become? Right? What would you want to do? And from there, that is a beginning of their creative inquiry, right? So again, I think that art students are a bit too inward, too much about self. So I've not encountered any who do not want to sort of explore themselves and understand themselves, but I also want them to think about how they relate to a public, to society, and how creativity can be used to solve or address, I shouldn't say solve, but to address some of the problems that we are currently experiencing in society. I think post-pandemic, students are struggling with mental health and understanding what is happening around them. They're barely able to focus on design, and that's why I think now autoethnography is very, very important to in terms of helping them to understand the complexity of these social issues that they're experiencing and witnessing and observing, etc., in the world.
Great. Well, we're right at 11:59, so I want to thank all three of you, and also to Jeff for kicking off this morning segment. We'll take a break until 11 or 12:50, and then we will kick off again in the second section. And thank you all so much for sharing with us. I think we all learned a lot this morning, and I'm really glad to be sharing it with this audience. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Audrey and Chris.
All right. Thank you, Dakota, Chris. Take care.